Okay, so we've got Dr. John Wilkinson with us now, who is going to follow on from that wonderful talk from Janet about amphibian ecology and talk to us about the threats that our amphibians face and how what we can do to conserve them. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Kieran. Hello, everybody. So you can see my job title there. I basically manage projects between Scotland and Jersey and everywhere in between. This time of year, I do a lot of training courses, and I also have a number of PhD students who are researching various things from non-native species to the effects of climate change. It's very hard to fit a talk on amphibian threats and conservation into half an hour, so I'm going to focus on one or two things that people might be more interested in or possibly know a little bit less about. Just to say that our species have different levels of protection. There are highly protected species that Janet's mentioned, which include the great crested newt and natterjack toad in Scotland, the bullfrog, which is only in England, and then the other species are less protected, but the common toad is also a biodiversity action plan priority species because of its declines in recent decades. So essentially, all species are only protected against sale in Great Britain. Some jurisdictions choose to fully protect all their amphibians, which is wise in my opinion. They're all declining. So let's briefly look at a selection of threats to amphibians. The big, the same as it is with biodiversity, is that of habitat loss. Simply the fact that where there used to be that, there isn't anymore. And I'm picking on housing developments here because every government we have, whatever colour or persuasion, seems to think that building houses is the answer to everything, even though there are about 1 million unoccupied homes in the United Kingdom at the moment. Without wishing to be too political, it's still true. Following on from actual loss of habitats is fragmentation, which includes things like roads. Roads are a barrier to amphibians and or cause mortality. Catherine mentioned that the gully pots project and building amphibian ladders, which is really a sticking plaster for this problem. It does help. And I'll talk about rescuing amphibians crossing roads a little bit later. Then, if you like, the other thing is habitat modification, so loss of features in the habitat. And the example I've chosen to use here, because we've got quite a nice frog, toad, and newt habitat visible in this picture, some trees, some woodland, some scrub, some grassland where they can forage. But actually, what's happened is the pond that they would breed in has been replaced by this bay, so the cattle can drink their water and the farmer doesn't have to come along and top it up. So actual loss of breeding sites as a feature in the habitat is another important factor. Janet's helpfully mentioned non-native species, and you'll be thinking, oh, well, there's a lovely picture of a great crested newt. It's actually not. It's an Italian crested newt, one of the non-native species we have in the UK. I'll mention those again a little bit later, but let's just look at the moment for the various effects that non-native species can have. They cause a lot of issues. One is competition, simply having extra species that our native ones aren't used to in the pond. They often do much better than our native species and they can simply survive better, eat more food, choose better egg laying sites, etc. And that really can affect our natives. Um, They will often predate native species. That's particularly true with things like American bullfrogs, which all being well have been wiped out at the moment in the UK, but larger, more aggressive species can eat our native species. They spread diseases, and Janet mentioned this already. Chytrid is a really big one. It's caused extinctions of many species of amphibian around the world, and declines are very often recorded. We don't think that there's any local extinctions caused by chytrid in the United Kingdom, but we do know that that species is present in the wild in the UK. So something that we really much have to keep an eye on. There is another chytrid, which I call chytrid 2, brackets really bad chytrid. It's called Batrachochytrium salamandrivorans, which means the newt eater. and actually it causes real problems for newts and salamanders on the continent. We don't have that in the wild in the UK yet, but it is in captivity here. So again, it's something that we very much need to keep an eye on. I'll show you a slide of that in a minute. There are potentially other issues with non-native species as well, including hybridization. So the Italian crested newt I showed you can interbreed with great crested newts and cause issues for their populations in that way. There are some salamanders infected with that super bad chytrid. It's actually wiped out about 99% of all the salamanders in Belgium, the Netherlands, and southwest Germany. The only thing they found that helps it is actually taking animals into captivity and treating them intensively with various medications, and also basically disinfecting the ponds areas that they live. So it's very much something we don't want to get in the UK. And you can see from the list of places where they've studied it below that it's in a lot of different places in the wild in continental Europe already. So sorry to give a bad message, as it were, but we really have to be aware of these things. It's only a matter of time, probably. Then, of course, there's climate change, a rather extreme example photograph of climate change there, but we've seen lots of this on the news just recently. And when I was creating this slide, I thought, well, where on earth do I start? The effects of climate change are really quite far reaching. Wildfires are only one. Amphibians, reptiles, and other biodiversity are easily killed by wildfires. They simply don't have the mobility to escape. And in a similar vein, they can also be very susceptible to flooding. So a hibernating amphibian, let's say under some tree roots or down a rabbit burrow, is just as likely to drown as, for example, a mouse or whatever, if that area is extensively flooded whilst they're torpid. So if that wasn't bad enough, there are fundamental habitat changes that climate change causes. So, for example, a damp area that would be suitable for amphibians decides to dry out. A woodland starts to be less humid and contains less prey. Ponds can dry earlier with fundamental climate change. They sometimes fill up earlier as well, I have to say. So amphibians could breed earlier, but it's a case of whether the water remains in the pond long enough for their tadpoles to survive. And that's a particular issue for things like great crested newts that have a long tadpole period or can have a long tadpole period. And then there are more subtle issues like false springs. So we see that, for example, with the common frog, where it's warm at this time of year. They come out and they start trying to breed, and then we get a very cold snap in the beginning of March, and it kills off all or some of their spawn. This also applies to non-amphibian species like adders, which come out of hibernation too early and get killed by frosts later on. And again, more subtle things are disconnects with prey emergence. So, for example, frogs come out and happily breed. They go off and they're knackered basically because they need to feed up once they've spawned. And there isn't any insects about for them because they emerged already and gone away, or they're going to emerge later on in the spring when the conditions are right. Lastly, something that one of my students, as I say, is looking at is the effects of warmer winters, because we know a little bit more about the effects of warmer summers than we do about warmer winters. Warmer winters are as bad, if not worse, if you're an amphibian or a reptile. They need a certain level of cool temperatures in order to hibernate properly. If it starts to warm up too much, they start to wake up. They use more energy. As I say, they might emerge from hibernation a bit too early. But more importantly, when they start to breed, they've used up some of the energy that the females in particular would spend on reproduction. So you get thinner, less energetic females with the ability to produce less spawn. So you end up with poor breeding. And there are studies on toads in particular that show that after warmer winters, some of the females are more inclined to die after they've spawned, but also that their spawning is poorer and the numbers of eggs in the spawn are fewer. So lots and lots of sometimes quite subtle effects of climate change there. You can also imagine that if those effects act together, you're more likely to get a local amphibian population decline. Pollution is one I don't want to talk too much about because that's a whole lecture all on its own, to be perfectly honest. But there are many, many different ways that pollution can affect amphibians. There's deposition, for example, from power station emissions. There's other forms of deposition like acid rain. There's individual pollution events, so a pond might be deliberately or otherwise poisoned by something. And then there's a very subtle effect, things like heavy metal in the soils that are likely to affect amphibians breeding over time. As I say, that demands a whole talk all by itself. Let's look now at the conservation of individual species, starting with the smaller newts. We've seen a nice male smooth newt with his lovely smooth crest already. Essentially, at the moment, they're both widespread and that happily they readily utilise garden ponds and municipal ponds. So any kind of small breeding water body they can use. But there's no doubt that they've both declined because the simple fact of the matter is that pond losses have been terrible since, especially since the Second World War, and 60% since about 1900. So again, as Janet referred to, they preferred different types of ponds. So believe it or not, there are more ponds where both species occur than generally realised. But the bottom line is smooth newts live in a more usual garden pond where palmates like tiny or I say like they can survive more adequately in tiny, cold, upland, acidic and leaflet-filled ponds better than the other species. So they are often called the Highland newt. I like to think of them as the Celtic newt, and they're also the only newt that lives in Jersey. So they know the number of ponds is going up because people understand that ponds are important for amphibians and a whole other range of biodiversity. Management of ponds is a lot more difficult to get funded, and the suggestion is that the overall quality of ponds is declining. They get too shaded, they get lots of too many leaves in the water, and just general lack of management, which means that they become less suitable for amphibians over time. But as we've already seen, newts sometimes like these shady, cool, leaf-filled ponds, and they might in places be actually increasing. We did a report some years ago now where the occupancy rates of palmate newts in our surveys actually increased. Now, there are two possible reasons for it. One is that we're getting better at telling people how to identify palmate newts. So male and female smooth and palmate newts are the hardest things to tell apart if you're an amphibian biologist. But it's quite likely that actually the quality of our ponds is generally just going down ever so slightly, and palmate newts are getting a small advantage from that. This requires more study, of course. The great crested newt is the species that a lot of people hear about because being highly protected, they get, how shall I say, vilified with holding up developments sometimes. They're a European protected species, which gives their level of protection, but actually they're still widespread taken into the countryside as a whole. And where they are found, they can be abundant. I emphasise they can, because in many places they aren't. In Scotland, we suspect they're not doing terribly well at the moment. So the protection that the UK gives them arises from the international importance of our populations and the historic declines which we know about, which have mirrored our pond losses. So in particular, they are very, very intolerant of the presence of fish in a pond, and people do like to put fish in ponds. This particularly affects their larvae, which swim around in the open water, as Janet demonstrated, and are very susceptible to being eaten. They also persist better in metapopulations, and this goes back to the fragmentation of habitats. So, associated populations, which ideally, if you're a great crested newt, are less than 250 meters apart, mean you likely get a better great crested newt populations. Interchange of individuals is enabled, and the populations are more robust. Uh, just as an aside, they don't always lay eggs in all the ponds, and some ponds do not produce juveniles at all. So if a road separates those metapopulations, one pond from another, the great crested newt population is likely to decline. A lovely great crested newt pond. I think everybody would say that was a lovely pond. Actually, you might get quite a lot of different amphibians breeding in there, but they'll also use terrible, terrible looking places like this. This is an old leather tannery pit in South Wales, which has breeding great crested newts in it. It also, however, has other ponds nearby, which helps the population persist. I mentioned hybridization and Italian crested newts. We now have extra ones to worry about. This is a marbled newt, which is, again, a very attractive species like the alpine that was brought into the country for pet keeping. The Italian crested newts is well established, probably only in various places in England as far as we know, but always want to look out for. And there are more and more marbled newt populations popping up. So I always like to emphasize that. Both species will hybridize with great crested newts, and we just don't know what the effects are at the moment. I would say, though, probably not great. The frogs, happily again, although they've got clients in the wild, especially in farmland, we do successfully utilize gardens and amenity ponds. We don't have a lot of concern about frogs at the moment, but they do not really like fish. For most species, likely problems are related to declining connectivity, but they also suffer from certain diseases, not much the chytrid, but there are things like rhinovirus and herpes virus, which is not the same as human herpes virus, by the way, are having local effects on their populations. Just to quickly mention, as it doesn't occur in Scotland, the pool frog, I will rush through this, I'm a little bit behind. They've been present in eastern England for a long, long time, but everybody thought that they weren't native. Anyway, they were found to be, and the UK ones are related to those from Scandinavia rather than France or Belgium. They've been reintroduced from Sweden, and although the results have been variable, we've now established a second site where they seem to be doing better. They use very specialized habitats. I can't often resist calling them pingu habitats, but that would be wrong. They're called pingo ponds, which are caused by glacial retreat. And really the message and the reason why I've included pool frogs is one of the species that requires continuous management in order to survive, including actually rearing tadpoles to a certain extent. So that's ongoing. You can find out more, should you wish to, on the ARC website. There's just a shot of some people spotting pool frogs at one of the sites. Can't really do this talk without talking about toads. They've been declining for about 40 years. They're one of our species of most conservation concern because the declines are ongoing and we don't really understand them. We do know that genetics are different in toads than they are of frogs. Frogs will spawn just about anywhere, like in ditches, as Janet says, whereas toads really like to return to their native breeding ponds. And that may be a significant factor in some of the declines. So again, we're looking at issues caused by habitat loss and connectivity. There's a nice toad pond, different to the one Janet showed you. And there's been some research on this. There's been quite a lot of research on it, actually. But more recently, this particular paper demonstrated that information collected by toad rescuers shows that toads have declined over time, and that's from the UK and from Switzerland. So it's not just a UK problem. Other people, however, assert that road mortality of toads and other species doesn't affect populations, and it might be a bit of a waste of time. The obvious thing is to say then, well, what do I think? Well, I got some data from a local toad rescue to me, a place called Cludley. Volunteers in that year assisted over 1,300 toads crossing the road, including at least 143 females. Well, that reveals one thing that's interesting. You very often get many, many fewer females than you do males, and that's true with all amphibians, but it's particularly true with toads, where there's between twice as many and 10 times as many males as there are females. So if the females get killed off, you've already got the start of a population decline. And just to round the numbers up, if every female toad can lay about 2,000 eggs a year, saving those 1,300 female toads has resulted in approximately 286,000 more tadpoles than if they hadn't survived. And then if only 1% of those tadpoles live to be adults, that's still nearly 3,000 more toads. So those people that assert that rescuing toads and saving them with gully pots, ladders, for example, isn't having an effect, I think every female toad you manage to help survive has a positive message for conservation. So if you can get involved with any of those projects, for example, in Tayside Arg, that would be a really good thing to do. I have to say this is back of an envelope science. Hopefully the process is logical, but you can see that probably tell actually that I believe that rescuing toads is a worthwhile thing to do. But really the overall message with amphibian declines, threats and conservation is declines generally happen when two or more things go on at once that the population can't cope with. So a number of synergistic causes. And the worst thing, because amphibians are fickle creatures, they have naturally fluctuating populations, which could happen over 6 years or say 12 years. We don't really know very much about it. It varies with the species. It probably varies with the site. And let's say you're on a population low and suddenly there's a pollution incident in a pond. That's when you might get a local extinction or severe decline of that population. Just to add again, another positive that, or if you see it that way, that toads have declined so much in the UK that they're now a feature that enables people to notify them as a feature on a triple SI, which is good news. Lastly, natterjacks, which we've heard a lot about, very specialised habitats, and in the UK and Ireland, their range is extremely restricted. They are another European protected species. The natterjack from Portugal I found many years ago, and just to say, they're not so rare there. This was taken on a piece of wasteland behind a housing estate. It's because they live on the edge of their range in the UK, really, that they're a bit more fussy about their habitats and need more conservation intervention. We have seen habitats. There's a reminder of what Janet showed you. They do share these characteristics of small, shallow, warm pools and low grazed turf that enable the juveniles to survive, develop more quickly and disperse following metamorphosis. At the majority of sites, then, they need a lot of help, including grazing. They also benefit from dune mobilisation on their coastal sites, which the other amphibians don't really like much. The species' long-term survival is still threatened in the UK, especially by climate change. So you can imagine if we get sea level rise, some of these sites that natterjacks use are going to be full of seawater, and they won't tolerate full seawater, I can tell you. So my question really about that is, should we now give more consideration to helping, restoring and managing the sites that natterjacks used to live on that were more inland, that then won't be so affected by climate change and sea level rise. And that actually is a slightly rushed version of my talk. But thanks very much for listening, and refer to the links that are in the chat. And with